Thank you everyone for joining the webinar today, which is reflecting on 10 years since the publication of the National Planning Policy Framework. The NPPF sets out the government's planning policies for England and is a material consideration in planning decisions. The NPPF was first published in 2012 and resulted in quite a change to planning, consolidating many planning policy statements and planning policy guidance notes. And since it was first published, the NPPF was revised in July 2018, updated in February 2019, and revised again in July 2021. I expect there'll be many of us on the call who won't have known planning pre-NPPF and are interested to hear how it changed planning, perhaps the positives and the negatives, and what we can learn going forward. And I know, talking to the panelists before we join the webinar now, there's some really interesting points that came up. So it should be a really interesting discussion. So we'll hear from each panel member before going into a Q&A and discussion. On the panel, we've got Steve Quartermaine, Dom Veasey, Liz Beighton and Mary Cook. I'll let each panel member introduce themselves, and then if anyone listening has any questions as we go along, please submit them in the chat and we'll try to get through them after all the panelists have spoken. So I will hand over to Steve, and Steve, I'll let you introduce yourself and then you can go into your talk.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and well, good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm Steve Quartermaine. I had a career in local government. I was a Director of Planning and Environmental Services in North Yorkshire before I became Chief Planner in 2008. I was Chief Planner for 2008 to 2020, and now I do all sorts of things that ex-civil servants do. But I suppose I wanted to sort of begin by reflecting on my career in local government, and I am one of those people that does remember planning prior to the NPPF. What a joy it was. I still have my paper copies of things like PPG 13, and I can well remember the joy of sort of writing appeal statements and the creative buzz you got from sort of going through all these documents, effectively cherry picking these phrases that best suited your argument, whilst of course the appellant was doing exactly the opposite. It was going through cherry picking the bits that best suited their argument. It was, could you stitch together an argument from all the various PPGs which would support your conclusion? And having said that, when I arrived in central government in 2008, I did arrive with the idea that actually it would be quite a good idea if some of these PPGs and PPSs were consolidated, were brought together into a more coherent approach. You had teams of people who were responsible for particular documents. So you sort of had a PPG 13 team, and you had a PPG 3 team, and you started thinking, well, these needed to be sort of more joined up and read across more, and so on and so forth. So I went into DCLG thinking that it would be great. One of the things I'll try and do as Chief Planner would be to try and consolidate and pull all these documents together. However, my bubble was very quickly burst, because what happened was I started talking to the deputy directors that were in the teams and the people that were responsible for various bits of the paper, and it was clear that what they said was, well, that may be what happens in local government, Steve. You come up with sort of good ideas and you go to your members and say, do you want to do this? In central government, it doesn't quite work that way. We're servants of the government, and unless the minister or the government has actually asked for this to be done, it's very difficult to commit work in an area which they haven't asked you to do. And so it became clear that it wasn't up to me to actually go and say, well, why don't we do this? You had to sort of wait your time. You had to wait for your moment and to come. It was interesting because actually, to their credit, to the team, they're doing quite a bit of work on thinking about if that moment came, and if ministers said, why don't we consolidate something, they've done some work about what this might look like, and they'd actually started to pull together. And the memories, I can't remember whether it's 2 or 3. I think it was 3 volumes that they were arguing we would end up with, instead of all these different PPG3s. We'd end up with 2 or 3 volumes. One definitely orientated towards sort of development management, another one on sort of the broader policy, and I think there was a third to sweep up anything else that didn't fit into those 2. So if I roll the clock forward 2 or 3 years, and having sort of, as a team, to be fair, taken every opportunity to try and nudge incoming ministers as to what a good idea it might be to do something in this space, we did eventually have a minister who thought it was a good idea, and that minister was Greg Clark, who was very supportive of the idea. The thing was, he wasn't 100% supportive of the idea that this was a document that could be written by the civil servants. I don't know whether that was looking back and sort of thinking, well, if what the civil servants have done is produced 25, 26 volumes of stuff, the PPG 13 alone is 44 pages. Were they going to write something which was going to be, in his mind, the succinct document that I think he was looking for? I mean, frustratingly, given, as I said, that we've been thinking about it, it was a bit frustrating that he thought that an external body would be a good idea to start with, and I think it's probably, I'm still covered by the Official Secrets Act, so I probably can't really tell you exactly how much feeding that group the civil servants did in terms of trying to make sure they had the information, the sort of the background documents, and the approach they did. But eventually, they wrote a document, and it seemed to be well received. Now, that, to be honest, was quite a relief, because not only did it sort of give a more of a green light to going on from that point. Yes, something could be done. Of course, if it hadn't been well received, then it was quite clever, really, wasn't it? Because the government could always distance itself from it and said, well, obviously that doesn't work, we're going to stick with the current system. But because it was broadly well received, we were then asked, as civil servants, to take a version through what's regarded the proper channel. So we were then asked to come away from that document and to write the NPPF. Now, there was some very detailed consideration of that document, and the ministers were pretty much hands-on on the writing, advised by QCs. I can well remember there were meetings when we would have long pauses whilst the debate raged about whether it needed to say should or must. So it was quite a hands-on process, if I'm honest. But eventually we wrote a document which the minister presented to the House, and he was happy with it. I think it's fair to say that there was a recognition amongst the team that it wasn't perfect, and that in part reflects the fact that there were some issues which the minister definitely wanted to see in it. And it was hard sometimes to nuance and shape those into a document that read coherently. And certainly I was, I think, a little puzzled, perhaps is the right word, then, and I still am, about what status the ministerial forward had. You were producing an NPPF, but it had a ministerial forward that said things. And the ministerial forward said things like, the purpose of planning is to help achieve sustainable development. But as that was in the forward, was that the government's policy, or was that a forward to the policy? And I think there were some issues there about, well, how clear were we being? But it's fair to say that the 2012 document stood the test of time to 2018, so around 6 years without amendment, and it's been amended a couple of times since. And in just over 50 pages, it was a fairly succinct expression of the government's planning policy at the time. And as I said, some of the other documents, PPG 13 was 44 pages, the PPG 3 was quite a lengthy document. So there was a good a feeling about having tried to capture the government's policy more succinctly. Now, having said that, some of the debate that then sort of followed, which we'll probably talk about today, was, well, what was left on the table and what wasn't in it that needed to still have some traction. And to be fair, and I'll conclude by saying, Of course, the NPPF now needs rewriting. There's been a number of reasons: the climate change issue, the Build Back Greener issue. There's the whole town centre section is now sort of warrants a good look at post Class E. And I think that perhaps I'll leave you with a thought that whether or not another external panel might be useful in trying to pull together an advice to government about what the NPPF 2022 might look like. Thank you, Rebecca. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Should I jump in now? Yeah.
Yeah, go
Perfect.
for it.
So I'm Dominic Veasey. I'm a sort of head up Nexus Planning's research analytics team. But before Nexus, I worked with Steve at the department, and I was involved with the NPPF, and I can't for the life of me remember the PPS number that I was actually in charge of or worked with. It was always town centres, but I can't for the life remember which one it was now. But that was one I was responsible for at the time. And before that, I was working with the South East England Regional Assembly on preparation of the South East Plan. So I've got a sort of a strong strategic background there. What I wanted to do was to focus on sort of the slightly wider context of the NPPF and the reform package at the time, just to pick up on a couple of things that are particularly focusing on Greg Clark's speech to the House when he was commending the NPPF. And unsurprising, like every, I think, minister since 1947 has actually said that he was saying the planning system was broken and it needed completely rewriting and fixing. And part of the reason for the reforms in the NPPF and the challenges, I was going to pick out two sort of flags that just have particularly caught my eye. The first was that regional spatial strategies and top-down targets alongside the National Planning Policy Guidance that had swelled beyond 1,000 pages that you quoted in 44 documents, was causing people to feel that planning was being put on them, development was being put on them, they weren't getting a say. So it was the rise of the NIMBY sort of issue. And that we had that, the part of that was the localism agenda. And there was a firm belief, and I'm pretty sure it was actual, their belief was that if they gave powers to local people to choose where development would go and what it would look like, they would genuinely be welcoming with open arms, and we couldn't get enough of housing in the back gardens. I think that was the genuine belief at the time. And I think obviously a few years later, the cries of localism fell quite silent across Whitehall, and I think it was quite clear that that clearly had failed. But yet, 10 years later, this centralist top-down targets that the regional assemblies were putting in place, and arguably they were very localist because local authorities and the county councils were working together to identify the housing needs and how they're best distributed. We now have obviously the standard methodology and what is the minimum targets and a very centralist dictated sort of system of requirements. But thankfully, more recently, the government have accepted that the duty to cooperate in the NPPF has failed, and that some form of strategic planning is required and is essential. It's just unfortunate that, in my mind, the best geography is the regions, which I don't think the government will finally accept the full mistake of abolishing the regional spatial strategies and bring back regional planning, but it's certainly needed. In terms of the sprawling guidance, obviously the PPSs and PPGs were seen by Greg, and as he quotes, despite 12 years of attempts to make these guidance documents clear and simple, they have remained sprawling and cumbersome, and more damagingly, these documents are produced and are revised on an ad hoc basis and in a piecemeal nature. So the solution was this 52-page NPPF, and it was only going to be accompanied by guides where absolutely necessary. So 10 years on, we now have an NPPF which is 75 pages long, so it's crept already in length, and has been revised no less than 4 times over the last 10 years. The PPG is technically a single document, but it contains 59 sections, and within that there are hyperlinks to other documents and guidance. There are a further 8 separate guidance documents which accompany the PPG. And so overall, my concern is we're again not repeating the mistakes of the past by constantly changing and chopping and changing policy and guidance. And the PPG, I think, has been updated or amended at least once every year since it was introduced in 2013. So I think the point I'm driving at here is the consistency basis, that the planning system needs consistency. Looking at the second challenge that Greg was sort of highlighting and commending the NPPF was that over the last, as he says, over the last decade, so that would be 2001 to 2012, we built fewer homes than any peacetime decade for the last 100 years. And this is where we start to see the fixation with this 300,000 homes per annum target, which is our mind that we've seemed to have got a little bit fixated on necessarily. And I'm just going to now quickly share a screen just to show a graphic, which I think you'll probably have quite a few have already seen quite a few times in the past. But this is housing delivery since 1947. The pink is local authority delivered housing. The orange is registered providers, and the blue is the market. And obviously the dotted line is this magical 300,000 figure, and you can clearly see that we haven't got anywhere close to that ever since the last 50, 60 years, since the major housing construction program from the government. But what I wanted to particularly highlight is that in periods here, I think you're in sort of 2002, the early 2000s, you get a planning uncertainty. We're reforming the planning system, a new system comes in place, and consistency starts to build and things start to improve and grow. Yet then we get uncertainty again, obviously hampered by the global recession here, but uncertainty again, the new system starts to bed down and down and down, things start to improve. So it's a question of what if we left a system in place, like the regional system, in place for 10, 15, 20 years? How far could we have got with that certainty, consistency, without the constant meddling? We've had 10 housing ministers over the last 10 years. How close could we have got? Could we possibly get to this delivery with consistency and a planning system? So effectively, the key thing I'm sort of wanting to sort of highlight is that the lessons we need to have learned is that the planning system isn't broken. You're never going to get a perfect NPPF or a framework. But what you do need is consistency, and I think at the minute we've got a little bit too fixated on the certain targets. That we need to, the chopping and changing and the constant meddling is causing huge problems. And again, I think we're now again seeing it again with the delays to the current planning reforms, that a lot of local authorities are starting to go, oh, let's just pause, let's have a think about this. Should we sort of pause plan making? Should we withdraw the whole plan because things are going to change? I'm sort of concerned that we are constantly, we're sort of trapped in this sort of cycle at the minute of constantly changing things. We need to let consistency happen. And again, I think we do need to get a regional tier or some sort of strategic tier in place very quickly, because I think that is going to be key to actually successful delivery. So I'll leave it there for that's okay. I'll stop sharing if I can remember it. There we go.
You want me to just jump in, Rebecca?
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Perfect. Afternoon, everyone. I'll just share a quick slide, if I may. And it's not as informative as Dom's. It's more comedy. Can that be seen? Just
Yeah.
Perfect. I think I need to put it on. There we go. No, they're just 3 images. On the left-hand side is probably one of my favourite planning cartoonists, Rob Cowan, and I think that sums up sort of like the transition from NPPFs to PPGs in terms of the stripping of the jargon, reduced size. To the right, actually, it's a post that cropped up on my Facebook the other day, and I thought that was quite pertinent to put up, how I felt 13 minutes before we moved to the NPPF and how we felt it was all going to be confusing, consultations they'd been ignored, and I think there was just that worry amongst the planning profession at the time. And the other thing is just one of my favourite songs, I think, that sums up planning, Little Boxes. I don't think it relates to any particular volume house builder, but listening to the song again this morning, I don't think it fully embraces the Building Beautiful agenda that's currently in. So let me just. So no, they're just my little comedy. So I'm a director at Boyer Planning based in the Colchester office, and I've been there since June last year. When Judith asked me to speak here, the first thing I started to look at is why I got into planning and what drove me to be a planner. And like most planners, I have absolutely no idea how I got into planning. I was a geographer at school. I loved geography. I loved economics and politics. And this was before career days. So we had a computer program where you churn in all your interests and your desires and it tells you what you should do. So I did that one day and the outcome was either a funeral director or a ballet dancer. Neither really appropriate for me. Probably the most uncoordinated person there is. But for some reason, I decided to look into planning and I went and organised some work experience at Suffolk Coastal, my home authority. And although it was stuffy, we were shoved in a basement away from everyone. Desks were covered with paper, and there was very little enthusiasm. For some reason, it did tickle my taste buds, and I signed up for a degree initially at South Bank, followed by a master's at Newcastle, and was taken under the wing of Patsy Healy, who completely infused planning into me, and I think she has done many people. She's an absolute legend. Graduated in '98 alongside a very good friend of mine, Victoria Hills, who gave me some awesome advice last night in a taxi on her way to another conference she's hosting today. So thank you, Victoria. So yeah, graduated. My first job at a district was at Chelmsford Borough, and on my first day I had a clear desk. Proudly sitting in the middle was PPG 8. Not because I was the best or I had the best knowledge at telecommunications, but I think the whole industry had worn everybody else in the office down. We're in the peak of the 3G rollout. We're bombarded with applications, mainly in residential areas, often near schools, highly controversial. That was my job. But obviously I had other applications. So I was in the majors team and I had half my desk was then covered with the PPGs, PPSs, circulars and the huge raft of guidance that sat alongside. We also had the Archie regional planning guidance with structure plans. And I have to say, in hindsight, they didn't always talk to each other as best as they could have done because they were often updated at different times. So some were more relevant than others. But I think for many planners at that time, those documents were our comfort blankets. They were our dummies. They led us to decision making. There was limited opportunity to think outside the box. I think in hindsight, and at the time we were set in a backdrop of development control rather than management. We're there to control growth rather than actually promote or manage growth. So along came 2012 and Steve's team to reform the planning system. The rationale was very much changed to plan for growth, rebalance the system, promote sustainable development, and importantly, restore the local control that was seen missing from many politicians. And that was part of that was to replace all of those rafts of documents with one streamlined, small 50-page document, the NPPF. And at that time, I'd moved from Chelmsford. I'd been up north and I'd wandered around a bit, done a bit more telecoms, and I'd ended up at Suffolk Coastal, halfway through its merging with Waveney to become East Suffolk, one of the first mega authorities in the country. I think to say we were cautious and nervous of this change is a massive understatement. I think we were going from massive documents spread over many volumes to something that was over 50 pages, which when we first read it swept away all the detail that we were used to seeing. We wondered how we could deal with planning applications with so little direction. We had to rethink our outlook. We had to learn to say yes more and no less. A starting point on our applications had to be one of positive, or at the very least, an acceptance that it was our job to engage and direct and guide with a view to supporting development. And how on earth could we do that with such little detail? But on top of that, we had to translate that new way of thinking to our members, to the agents and the public, and they needed to buy into that approach. And that really was a very difficult feat, given many years of resistance and a very protectionist planning function. But in hindsight, I think stripping away a lot of the text hasn't been so bad, and many of our fears are unfounded. I think in balance, it's the right balance between carrot and stick. And I think it's much more user-friendly and it enables us to be more empowered as a planning professional, although I have to say it's taken the most part of 10 years to settle down for a whole host of court decisions that no doubt Mary will pick up on, and to finesse the interpretation of many aspects of the NPPF. And I think we were probably slightly more proactive in the early days of it than we are now. And I think we have stepped back slightly to a more resistant culture of planning. But what the NPPF does, there is a crucial importance of having an up-to-date local plan, and that is the backbone of much of planning. It is clear that the ramifications are quite stringent if it is not the case. I mean, luckily at East Suffolk, we were going through the process of our local plan review at the time of the NPPF. So we, in 2013, adopted our core strategy, and we followed that up with 2 area action plans and a site specific. So as a council, we could apply the national guidance at the local level and reinsert some of that detail that was lost through the PPSs into our local policies. But there were many authorities who were not, and possibly still not, in that position. So a lack of detail, I think it enabled us to think outside the box, deliver a planning service. I think we became less akin to functional administrators working with a yes and a no stamp, which is how planners were often seen. We felt more empowered, a realisation that we could actually have a real influence on affecting people's communities and places. And it opened our eyes to, I think, the critical important role that planners have. And I think how we have been, and to a degree, we still are undervalued. And I think when we moved to the NPPF, I think that was the time when East Suffolk moved out of the basement as well up into the real parts of the planning building with other officers to integrate more and not just be pushed in the dark corner. But the lack of detail can make decisions more challengeable, and I anticipate, and again, I'll probably look to Mary, there's probably been more appeals and High Court challenges since 2012 than previous, with different interpretations of aspects, referencing particularly what does isolated mean in terms of, isolated dwellings in the countryside. And there is also therefore the required consistency from PINs in decision making. And again, I'm unconvinced that that is always the case, whether the NPPF has been applied consistently through appeal decisions. And that is something that as professionals we look towards to guide and offer advice to our clients. So it's been updated. I anticipate on the horizon, nutrient neutrality, biodiversity net gain, building beautiful. There's further updates on the horizon. I think they will come through more thick and fast than previously. I think Steve said, 2012 to 2018 there was one update. I think they're going to be more frequent, and I think that's going to have to keep us on our toes. But more importantly, it's going to have to keep the planning policy teams on their toes in terms of translating that national guidance and ideology down to the local level, either through local plans and neighbour plans or supplementary planning documents that sit alongside that. Just think of bear with me. So yeah, so I mean, going back to the policy, I think, as I say, the policy teams need to be on the front foot in realising these aspirations and give the DM officers the tools to actually deliver these aspirations on the ground. And they need to give the developers an appreciation of what they need to include in their submissions. I think one example of that is a building beautiful government aspiration, and what that actually means and how that's translated into policy. I think there's still, most local plans are still catching up on that. I think that will be another thing that is tested through appeal decisions in the High Court. Most local authorities are still working with rather generic design policies, which normally start with secure good design. But, design is subjective. What is good design? Do authorities have the expertise in-house to judge what beautiful and good design is? Big question mark. I think translating the NPPF has been, there's a need to have a much more collaborative process with external parties. And I think we're still some way off that. And I highlight particularly the likes of highways, drainage, who very much plan by numbers, plan by guidance, manual for streets. And I think departments are not talking to each other as much as they should be to fully embrace the NPPF. So yeah, I think, it's going back. Local plans is a key driver. There is concern that there is paralysis creeping across the local plan system. We're reading in the press, daily, weekly of councils who are not getting their local plans adopted, they're being withdrawn. And this is partly influenced by the growing localism agenda, but also the public interference and the government desire for the public to be much more involved in planning. Seamless ends of threats of legal challenge centred around allocations, loss of greenbelt seem to be the key themes arising. Now, not having an up-to-date local plan is very difficult to enable the DM team to actually instigate development and planning and to actually recognise we're in a housing crisis and we need to build more homes. The government are unlikely to step in on greenbelt authorities. So, you know, there's a concern about how we are going to see development increase. I think it's going to be much more frustrated. We're seeing a lot of authorities fall below the 5-year supply of housing, mainly greenbelt authorities. You know, 2- and 3-year housing is not an uncommon figure to see in those authorities. So the NPPF, it talks openly, I think all of them have since the starting point, Steve, about speeding up the planning system, promoting growth. But there needs, I think, in my view, to be greater interjection at the top tier to actually make that happen. And I think the local authorities need more help and assistance from those top tiers, whether that's through increased funding, resource, or stepping in to take more control back to make sure that that does happen and we don't stagnate. And I think the difficulty is, you know, the balance of the NPPF aspiration of pro-growth sitting alongside the greater localism and community input, which often sit at polarised views. And I'm not sure how we're going to overcome that. I'm not sure neighbourhood plans are the appropriate mechanism to overcome that. I'm sceptical about those. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I've luckily in my career worked for an authority that's been very proactive. And we've had an up-to-date suite of policy documents. We've had supportive members. But I think looking with consultancy eyes on, I see the frustration with the planning system. And I see the frustration of many professional planners working within local authorities who are unable to get up-to-date local plans and are unable to work often with the tools that they really want to. So what's in the future is a good question. It'd be interesting to hear what people's views are, how we can overcome this and how we can kind of marry these aspirations and get the NPPF really working. I think there's a lot of benefits. The Levelling Up white paper does clearly state that a strong planning system is vital to achieving their agenda. If anyone's bored, pages 227 to 228 kind of sum up the government's aims on that. But I think it's always going to be difficult with the improving democracy and engagement in also meeting this pro-growth agenda. But again, interesting to hear what other people's views are. Thanks, Rebecca.
Good afternoon, Mary Cook here from Town Legal. I'm a barrister and I definitely remember 2012. I was in the middle of an inquiry on the day this came out. There was great excitement. I absolutely remember the sort of sentiment that Elizabeth has talked about. I was doing planning inquiries. And by the way, I didn't even do a geography O-level. I fell into planning and I knew nothing about it, and I did a pupillage which introduced me to the world of planning. I met lots of exciting people, went to lots of different places, and I thought this is the career for me as a lawyer, planning. So I feel very privileged actually to have been able to work in a sector which I adore so much for so long. And I do reminisce about PPG3. That was, to me, boosting. That was when the boosting housing really started in terms of the policy guidance. When I started, there were no PPGs. It was the odd department circular, DOE this, DOE that. And I remember fondly PPG 24, which was all about noise and had lots of good technical guidance in it that we all followed when we were trying to work out the way forward in terms of putting housing near noise sources, particularly airports. I thought there was a lot of good stuff in the archaeology PPG, and when that was introduced, of course, that really transformed what was then a very limited kind of public funding archaeological profession to a developer-led archaeological world, which I think was a really positive step. Remember, also English Heritage had produced some guidance. They had 12 policies, HE1 to HE12, which effectively superseded what was PPG 15. They did quite a lot of work, and those policies were given a lot of weight by inspectors in decision making. So I mentioned that. Also, there was a flood risk planning practice guidance statement, again, which was pretty groundbreaking when it came in. And so all of these things were swept away. Steve has mentioned the old PPG 13, 44 pages. That was one of the oldest PPGs at the time in 2012. And frankly, it should have been updated. Really, I always thought by 2012, but no doubt it wasn't, because the NPF was coming down the line. I recall the buzz and the concern was the environmentalists thought that social benefits and economic benefits were going to be given more weight than environmental benefits. So there was a great deal of concern from heritage groups. There was also a great deal of concern for from national parks and those who were concerned about landscape and where was that going to get us, and what was a valued landscape supposed to mean. So I think those lobbies, those groups were the ones who were shouting loudest, actually, at the time of 2012. And I actually don't think they were necessarily too disappointed when the NPPF came out. But really what was the most groundbreaking thing was the golden thread, wasn't it? Paragraph 14 and the presumption in favour of sustainable development. And that was the bit that we were all grappling to understand. And the other thing was, there were some other paragraphs which at the time were quite significant. I remember the transportation paragraph 32. You know, you shouldn't be refusing planning permission on highway grounds unless there was a severe impact, taking into account cumulative effects. That was pretty groundbreaking at the time, considering just about every planning application anybody ever faces meets transportation and highway traffic issues in terms of locals. People were trying to grapple with the going from 12 quite distinct and, in my view, helpful historic England policies to just a couple of paragraphs. And again, people were trying to work out how the presumption in paragraph 14 sat with the balancing exercises that had to be done in a world where there was less than substantial harm or more than substantial harm. Were the public benefits going to be outweighed? I think in those early days, a lot of us were grappling with the competing presumptions, as it were, in the guidance. And of course, that led to quite a lot of issues in terms of court cases. I think the other thing that I found disappointing at the time was the way that the local plan section was shoved to the back. Remember that? The local plan section was shoved to the back of NPPF 2012. And I thought, what's all that about? Why do you want to do that when we have a plan-led system, when we have a presumption effectively that says that in considering planning applications, they should be determined in accordance with the development plan? Why would you then shove the development plan to the back end of the NPPF? I thought that was bonkers, and I was glad to see that eventually they ditched that and they put it back in the front. Because if we have a plan-led system, which we're supposed to have, again, it should all start with plan making. And I'm bound to say that PPG 12, there were several versions. There was a PPS 12 as well. There were several versions, and just before the 2012 NPPF, there was a version which placed a lot more weight on viability and infrastructure, and effectively said to plan making authorities, you need to be planning not only for your housing and your economic employment needs, but you need to be providing your infrastructure, hard and soft, and you need to be testing viability. I feel that took a step backwards when the NPPF first came out. I think that when you change national policy, you find plan-making authorities don't want to be the first guinea pig. And if you remember, the duty to cooperate was a massive thing. And in the beginning, plans failed on account of the duty to cooperate. So I think that put people off to start with. Then there were all the battles about OAN, objectively assessed need, and then we saw Dunstan, which wasn't a plan-making case; it was a Section 78 case, but that also brought issues with the old regional spatial strategy into the fore. That was a Greenbelt case, if you recall. So I think the NPPF created uncertainty in plan making. It created a degree of uncertainty in terms of decision making, none of which is really good in terms of investors investing in development, because after all, as Greg Clark said in his foreword, and I note Steve's observations about the foreword, which of course has fallen by the wayside. He said the planning system is about making things happen. It's supposed to be about delivery. It isn't just about planning permissions, is it? It's about delivery. And I think that all of the challenges that there have been, and that interesting chart that Dom put up, I think that suggests that, to my mind, that actually it hasn't been a rip-roaring success. It was all driven, I felt, by the need to remove red tape, and for an incoming Tory government to want to do something different and distinct. And remember that the South East Plan had been through quite a lot of hurdles. I felt that the industry was just getting used to regional planning, that they just accepted after all those years the South East Plan. I thought the regional planning was a good platform for central government to fund infrastructure, so that places like Basingstoke, they were identified in the South East Plan as places where there was going to be strategic growth. Basingstoke could expect, for example, a decent chunk of money from central government to help fund it. All of that sort of went out the window. I don't think it's been adequately replaced. I think that's one of the reasons why some local plans continue to fail, and why plans which are seeking to promote significant new settlements have struggled, frankly, in the system that the NPPF has created. So I think we certainly need to do something to alleviate that stress. So, although we've had a few iterations, and we're now in paragraph 11 as opposed to paragraph 14, effectively the presumption in favour of sustainable development has stuck with us. We've all understood it more. We've all understood that, I think, now the competing considerations. I feel that decision makers, and in particular I'm thinking about the Planning Inspectorate, I think in 2013, 14, 15, there was a much more bullish approach to the presumption in favour of development. I think we're retreating, and I think planning appeals are retreating backwards. And I think all of that is not helping us meet our housing targets. And all around the country, we can all see how the divergence between incomes and house prices, particularly in the southern areas, is just becoming more and more acute. And the government is introducing new forms of housing, which I think are more politically driven. I think, unfortunately, we have a 5-year cycle, and we have governments that just don't think beyond the next 5-year term, and I think that's a shame, because we need to be much bigger and much bolder as a country than simply looking to the next election. And after all, planning can be good. When it works, it can be great. Creating new places, and we've got lots of good examples. Let's just take King's Cross. I don't think anybody who goes to King's Cross isn't bowled over by what's going on in King's Cross. So I would like us to be much more positive about our planning and not be frightened of change. I think it's a bit of a national character that we're slightly frightened of change. So I'm not sure it's been a rip-roaring success, but I look forward to seeing what the Environment Act does, because I think that is a sea change. The idea of an Act of Parliament imposing a condition on all permissions to achieve something is quite a another step change, and I look forward to seeing how that works on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Some really interesting points there. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to comment on anything. Yeah, or we can go on to some questions.
I don't mind doing, if I can put my camera back on, I don't mind doing a little bit of response as I spoke first, but I want to make the point that I'm not chief planner now, and so I'm not here to defend the government's role. But equally, I do feel that there's a little bit of holding a mirror up to some of the things that have been said. I think that there was quite a lot in the 2012 version, which I think was laudable. I think from the outset, Greg Clark talked about a plan-led system. We also emphasised that the document needed to be read as a whole, and so there was an argument. It didn't matter where things were in the document. You needed to read the whole document, not just cherry pick from it. And it was trying to get away from this cherry picking various PPGs. You read the document, and in that document had the policy. And the plan-led system, it's not only in paragraph 14 of that version, but it also was in Greg's introduction. So having a plan-led system was absolutely critical. The golden thread was interesting. I think that's one thing that you might want to think about in terms of what's been lost in the iterations. The later versions, I think, improved the usability of the 2012 version in terms of ordering the stuff better, but it also meant that some things fell aside. I think we were surprised about how people picked up on particular words. I mean, I think we were very definitely on the words have their meaning. Sort of read the words as they're meant, and yet we were a bit surprised that we suddenly found people talking about what did isolated mean, and I think that that's probably a question best answered by the lawyers as to why they felt the need to talk about it. But I think there were some things, two final things quickly. One is, there's some things in there which are still part of the government's agenda, a whole section on achieving good design. And I suppose as a planning system, you've got to ask yourself, why is the planning system still not delivered universally better design? Why do we still have this question mark about does the planning system give good design? And I suppose I say that because that's what drives reform. Because if they look at the system, even I take Dom's point about consistency and allowing the market to settle and get a consistent approach. If in 2012 we were exhorting, and it was before, but if we were exhorting good design in 2012, you've got to ask yourself, why did the government still feel it necessary to have the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission? Because in that gap, why hadn't people stepped into that space, and why hadn't the system actually said, okay, we'll do what the NPPF says? And the final point I want to make, which is something which I think we all as practitioners lose sight of, is that these documents are promoted and put together and presented to the House. Mary made the point that they're political documents. And sometimes I think we lose sight of that, and we think that they're being, even though there's a professional body of people advising, ultimately they're a product of political manifestos. And don't forget that Eric Pickles himself wrote the manifesto documents before the 2010 election, which talked about what sort of planning system he wanted. Now, if he writes that document and then becomes Secretary of State for the department responsible for planning, you really can't be surprised if he then implements what he said he was going to do. And we sometimes lose sight of the fact that the department is driven by whichever political party, whichever government is in power. And I come back to my early lesson about being told by a deputy director, the civil servants are here as servants of the government. And I think that we sometimes need to remember that. And that's why you end up with various issues being sort of swept into the system and swept out again, depending on who's in power.
Dom, do you want to come
Yeah,
in?
it was just to build on what Steve just mentioned. I'd sort of half forgotten. One of the things that I hadn't appreciated until I joined the civil service was the priorities that each department are there. The civil service of each department is there to deliver the priorities of that department, and that minister is there to deliver the priorities of that minister and that department effectively. And the negotiations and discussions on various chapters and sections and wording of the NPPF was quite. It took me back by they were coming at it from purely from their department's priorities, not looking at the whole planning system as a whole. Effectively, it was quite an eye-opening experience, that was for me.
Interesting. We've had a few questions in the chat. I don't know if you can all see that. Perhaps I will start with. So Shelley has asked, do any of the speakers have a view on why planning policy for traveller sites has never been amalgamated into the NPPF, despite messaging from the government that it was being considered? It seems odd we have a separate policy framework for a very small group of society.
Can I jump in and say that I think one of the changes over the last 10 years is that there is more emphasis on differing sectors. So whether it's gypsies and travellers, older persons, students, that sort of thing, there is more emphasis. I think again we have to remember that the Tories and the Greenbelt and gypsies and travellers are not necessarily happy bedfellows. I remember going to a local plan examination where an inspector said to me, are you supposed to be counting gypsies and travellers for the purposes of housing requirements and also housing supply? And I think there was a little uncertainty when you got down to the NPPF 2012. I mean, there wasn't really much information, was there, in the first couple of years about how gypsies and travellers should be treated. But at least there now is in the planning practice guidance, a specialist chapter all about sectors. So I'd say things are improving in that regard.
Interesting.
Steve might have a better answer.
Well, I'm not sure it's a better answer. I think that initially in the 2012 period, we're talking about in the run-up to that document, there was work afoot regarding the gypsy and travellers and indeed show people's policy that was emerging from the government. And at the time, I think that there was a view that the 2012 version of the NPPF would be better launched and would have less risk attached to it if it didn't include that work at that time. But the question is quite right, that there was a commitment ultimately to merge the policies into a document, and we still wait for that to happen, and I think it should.
I want some of those points kind of lead on to one of the questions is, does the panel think we are moving back to a multiple guidance approach with the introduction of the National Design Guide, National Model Design Code? I don't know whether there's other guidance that has been mentioned as well in the talks. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that question first.
Well, briefly, the idea is still that the local authorities should be empowered to make decisions themselves. And don't forget that the NPPF was originally designed to be a policy document that local councils could use to make decisions with in the absence of a plan that covered those policy areas. And it's a bit the same with design codes. The National Design Code is a guide about how to do codes, and it has principles, the 10 overarching principles in the design code. And again, it was designed to be there for local authorities to use if they don't have one themselves. But the plan-led system is geared towards local councils taking that control themselves. Have your policies in your plan, have your design policies in your plan, and if you've got those, it's a plan-led system. So it only becomes multi-layered, if you like, in the absence of an up-to-date plan.
Although that doesn't stop you doing some design coding.
Indeed not.
It's a resourcing issue, I suspect.
Yeah.
And skills probably, I think, as well. Skills and resources.
I think that's a key point, Dom, and I kind of picked up on it. I think it's a skill shortage potentially in terms of design at many local authorities. And I think that has possibly hindered design guidance coming out. And I think there's a key, and I know Suffolk are doing it, they're working across all local authorities in Suffolk to produce a comprehensive design guide, because I think the key is, whereas a development plan will stop at a boundary, planning shouldn't stop at that administrative boundary, and it should be much more blurred. And I think it's in terms of that consistency across authorities, getting that consistent design advice out. Developers, agents kind of want that consistency to a degree, and I think working collaboratively and bringing back a more regional focus in that regard is possibly the right way to go.
Yeah, and there are lots of, or there are some organisations. I'm now going to confess I'm a trustee for Design South East, but there are organisations like Design South East who can help local authorities help themselves in terms of design coding, and I commend them.
Right, and I think we're coming to the end, but perhaps the final question for everyone on the panel is, do you think that consolidating the guidance has led to better planning outcomes over the last 10 years? Liz, perhaps should we start with you and kind of go around? Do you want a short answer?
I think it did to begin with, and I think we're just going back. I think it's stagnating a bit in terms of better decisions. I think, as Mary said, and I said as well, I think we're taking a step back in terms of the proactive planning. And I think it's now much more of a battle to get developments through, particularly the larger scale developments. There's a lot more, particularly in the south, there's a lot more public involvement, political involvement in it. You see a lot of councils now, pressure groups are now becoming part of the political makeup of councils, and that's causing a real issue. And I refer, potentially to Uttlesford as a key one, where it's getting really difficult in getting big planning decisions through. And to me, it's those sites and the big development that's going to yield the infrastructure. And that's the only way, I think, to get the infrastructure out is through strategic development, and that is being hindered. Authorities are not getting their 5-year supply. So I think it is causing problems, and I think that's partly to do with the localism aspect of it.
Interesting. Dom, have you got any thoughts?
I probably echo the same points, really. Yes. Is it causing a bit of an echo now? It is. Yeah. Originally there was a definite step change. It was becoming positive. Things were happening. But again, we're now I think we've become, let's get back to, too fixated with certain targets and figures that is actually causing a problem in terms of delivering good planning. I think that's, but the main problem, I think, is that, and also the strategic, it needs to be properly planning. Proper planning needs to happen at a higher level. That thinking needs to happen at a higher level rather than just in individual local areas.
Steve, are you coming in there?
Yeah. I mean, I'll couple of things. I mean, obviously the localism, levelling up white paper, and the regeneration and planning bill, whatever it's going to be called, might well deal with some of the strategic planning issues, and we can look forward to something there. I think the answer to the question is the NPPF has got huge potential to make a big difference, and I think that I would defend, if I needed to defend, the idea that we need more succinct planning policy. I think the frustration is the recognition that the words in the NPPF do have an impact, and I've argued quite recently that if you want to make effective changes to the planning system, you could actually make significant changes to the outcome of the planning system by changing some of the words in the NPPF. So, for example, a couple of people have mentioned the difficulty of large-scale development getting through the system. Well, just look at, I think it's paragraph 35, where it talks in the current version, which talked about the viability, deliverability tests and the like. I might have misquoted off the top of my head, misquoted the paragraph. But you've only got to change the wording in the NPPF about how you would test grand ambition. If you want a new settlement, you're not going to be able to demonstrate that in 15 years' time you're going to pay for every road and every transport bus stop. But if that stifles that ambition. Well, change the word in the NPPF, make it, particularly as you now need to have a plan updated every 5 years. If your original plan isn't working, change it in year 5, change it in year 10. And I think that that's what's being thwarted by the current approach. And I think that the solution is simple, which is to look at what the NPPF says and test its effectiveness. I think it does have the potential to underpin a great planning system. As Mary says, planning is great.
I think I'm afraid it's the government's fault that over the last few years we've stagnated. All this talk of planning reform has just caused everyone to sit there and wait for the great reform. Then the great reform doesn't happen. Then we get Boris going to a Tory government making a few ill-judged remarks, which then caused 1 or 2 councils to turn turtle in terms of their local plans. I mean, I feel frustrated. Whilst at the same time, you know, we've got some councils who are really trying hard and being proactive and are to be congratulated. And those are the councils that are achieving growth. They're the councils also that are achieving more than their fair share, as it were, of central government funding. And why not? If you have an up-to-date plan and you are planning for growth, why shouldn't you be rewarded in that way? I wonder whether just in future we'll see a bit more joint plan making, because I think these small districts and these small boroughs, it's incredibly onerous, and I see nothing wrong in boroughs coming together effectively, which is a bottom-up way of perhaps getting to a more regional approach.
Yeah, we're certainly seen that. Well, I'm based in Oxford, so around Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire, that's the approach we've seen. Thank you so much, everyone. That's been really, really interesting. Unfortunately, we've not managed to get through all the questions. We had a couple of other questions from Alan and Jenny. Sorry, we haven't got to those, but we are kind of out of time. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to the panelists.
It's been lovely. It's been great fun.
I think we could carry on talking.
Absolutely.
For a while.
Preferably over a drink next time.
Yes, yeah, we're all planning to get back to in-person events as well, separate women in planning branches. So looking forward to seeing some people at those. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone. And we'll hopefully get a recording of the webinar online for any colleagues that might have missed it or want to catch up. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Bye then.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Rebecca.